license. And so make sure you click in that box. You won't be able to submit a sighting if you don't. And then if you didn't take the photos, please enter the photographer in that box right below that. And then here, if you haven't selected PNW Bumble Bee Atlas or whatever Atlas project is your project, you can select it here just to indicate that you're submitting these to the Atlas project. But it's nicer just to have it as a default, and then you don't have to worry about that, which is what we did on the profile page in the beginning of this video. And you click Next, and it will take you to our interactive identification guide. So you can see there on the left the photos that you've uploaded. And then in the middle here is the option where you're going to choose the features that you see. And then on the far right is the possible bumblebees. And this list of bumblebees has already been narrowed down by your location. So the map has already chosen the possible species that could be found in that area. And you can further refine it by choosing the features that you see on the bee. So I can go over here and start looking at some of my photos and see what I see and then enter those features in there. So in this case, if I look here, I see that this bee has a yellow face. And I choose yellow face, and it narrows down the options and gets rid of bees that don't have a yellow face. And now I look at its thorax, and I can see that the thorax has yellow at the front of the thorax, and then the rest of the thorax is black. So I can choose yellow in front, and then it further narrows down the options. And then if I look at the abdomen, I can see that abdomen has a yellow stripe. So I can choose yellow stripe under abdomen, and again, it will further narrow the options down. And in this case, since this bee has black hairs on the underside of its abdomen and that yellow stripe, I can choose Bombus vosnesenskii because I know that's the species. And then you can scroll down and click Submit, and you will have entered your data into the database. And if you have more bees to enter, like we do in our situation, we can go to Record a Sighting and just click Bumblebee Sighting again and start entering a new sighting. So you're going to choose the photos for your second bee, which in this case is 2325 to 2327, according to my data sheet. And now that I've already entered that location once, I can select a previous location. So I just start typing in there, and it will bring up all of my previous locations. And I just want to zoom in to make sure that it's the right place. And indeed it is. It's by the Oregon Zoo, and it's in the same area where I just clicked, which is great. And then you're going to choose the accuracy again and enter the correct date of the sighting. Enter the floral host or nest searching or whatever information is appropriate. Click that photo permission box, and then Next, and then I'm back to my identification guide. And in this case, it has a yellow face. It has a black band between the wings there, so I'm going to choose that. And then this one has a red tail, so I'm going to choose red tail, and it will narrow it down. In this case, I've got Bombus mixtus. And then I can click Next, and my second bee is already entered. You can see how this gets faster as we move along. Choose Record a Sighting, and then I want to enter those last photos of this last bee, which were the photos 2328 to 2331. I choose the three best of them, click Open, and it automatically starts entering those in the database. And again, I can go down and start typing the location in there, click that. It will automatically enter the data in the database. I choose the accuracy and the date. And then I can scroll down and enter the floral host again. In this case, this bee was visiting a dandelion, so I want to type in either the common or the scientific name of dandelion, and then click the photo permission box and Next, and I'm back to the identification page. I choose yellow face, yellow in front, yellow stripe. It narrows down those options. I choose Bombus vosnesenskii, and then I choose Next. Note that if you don't know what it is, you can always choose Not Sure, and that will just enter This is Bumblebee and leave the identification up to the experts, which you're more than welcome to do. But now you're done. You've entered all of your data in the database for your bumblebees, and you can move on and start collecting your habitat data. So let's go do that. Now that you are done entering your Bumblebee data, you can enter your habitat data into the Bumblebee Atlas website. And in order to do that, you're going to go to the home page. In this case, I went to pnwbumblebeeatlas.org. You might go to nebraskabumblebeeatlas.org for another Bumblebee Atlas project if one gets launched. And you're going to go to the Data tab and choose Habitat Data Entry. And that'll bring up the form embedded in the website. And this is a little, I'll be honest, I find this a little funky to have a scrolling window within a larger window. So what I like to do is just click on this link here, which will open the form in its own window. And then once that form is open, you're basically just going to be transferring the data from your data sheet into this form here. There is some introductory information here in the beginning. So you're just going to type your name and your email address. Please make sure to use the same email address that you have used throughout the rest of the other projects. So the same one you used to adopt a grid cell and the same one that is associated with your Bumblebee Watch account. Then you're going to enter your Bumblebee Watch username and your home zip code. Then you're going to enter the survey data, and most of this data is going to be right on your data sheet. So the site name, and again, you want to use the same site name that you used when you enter your Bumblebee data. Make sure it's almost exactly the same if you can. The date of the survey, which was April 17, whether it was a point survey or a road survey. In this case, we did a point survey. The grid cell ID. My survey took place in Oregon 22, so I'm going to choose that. The start time of my survey, which was 3:45 p.m. And then it's going to take you to the map. And this is where you can enter the location of your survey into the map. And we want to be sure to use the same latitude and longitude at which we entered our Bumblebee data. So the best thing to do there is to go back to Bumblebee Watch. So if you open up a new window with Bumblebee Watch in there, then you can just go to your profile or go to Explore Data and choose B-List. And then if you enter yourself as the observer in this box right here, you can filter the observations to only see your own in that box. And then you need to find the one from that survey. So here's my Arboretum video sighting. And here is one of the bees from that. And the latitude and longitude where I submitted my bee data is right there. So I can copy that information by doing Control-C, or I can right-click and then choose Copy, or if you're on a Mac, you could use Apple Copy. However you want to copy those data is great. And then go back over to your PNW Habitat Survey, and you can paste that information by doing Control-V or right-click Paste, or however you do it on your device, and then hit enter, and it should zoom directly into that site. And you want to make sure that it's the same location where you submitted, that you didn't make some error in the process. But for me, that's definitely where I did the Bumblebee survey, so I'm good. If for some reason you can't find the latitude and longitude, or it's just not working from you, you can use this map the same way that you would other. You can zoom, you can drag and drop, you can use this search bar in the same way that you would in the same way that you would a Google map, where you click on it and it'll zoom into it. And drop that pin in that location. But the best thing to do is to get the same latitude and longitude that you used for your Bumblebee data and hit enter, and it will enter that exact same spot into the map, which will make finding your habitat data and your Bumblebee data much easier for the team that's analyzing the data. Then you scroll down and you're going to enter the number of bumblebees that you found in your survey. In this case, we saw 3. And then it's going to ask whether you submitted your Bumblebee data to Bumblebee Watch. Yes, we have. And then here, to further help us associate your Bumblebee data from your survey with the habitat data, we're going to ask you to go back to your to Bumblebee Watch and copy the URL from that site. So you're going to go back to Bumblebee Watch, and you're going to choose one of the records from that survey, the same one where you just got the latitude and longitude is perfect. You're going to click on the bee ID, and then you're just going to copy the URL from the search browser from the top here, and then navigate back to the habitat form, and you're going to just paste that in there. So the same Control-C, Control-V to paste that in there, or however you would normally do that. And then now I know that that's one bumblebee observation from your sighting, from your survey. If you didn't see any bumblebees in your site, you would check this box here, and then this option would never show up, and it shouldn't pose a problem for you. So that's just where you would indicate that you did not observe any bumblebees. Of course, you'd also have a 0 in this box up here. Then you're just going to be transferring information from your data sheet to the form here. So you're going to enter in the temperature, the average wind speed, the percent cover, any weather notes that you had here. So you could say, in this case, it was a warm, sunny day. You could add that in there. If it was windy, you might want to tell us that, or if it was cloudy, or if the weather changed during the course of your survey, you might want to add some information in there. And then you could add any site description that you put on your data sheet. Here I'm just going to describe the habitat briefly, which will also come here. And then you're gonna again, right from your data sheet, you're gonna select whatever you circled there. In this case, it was a natural area in a park setting. And then you're gonna choose the surrounding areas as well. So there was some developed park around there, a natural area with a park setting, and then there was also some woodland surrounding it. Next, it's how much of the area had flowering resources available. I circled 10 to 20. You can choose whichever one was closer of your survey. In this case, I think it was right in between. I'm going to round up and say 20%. Which of the following features did you see in or near the survey area? Again, this has just come directly off of the habitat form that you filled out when you were in the field. So in this case, I didn't see any bunch grasses, but I did see rodent holes, I did see brush piles, I did see bare soil, I did see leaf litter, I did see pine needle duff. I did not see any rock piles. If you saw none of those features, you would just click this option here at the very bottom. If you are filling out this form for the Nebraska Bumble Bee Atlas, you may or likely would, or you might likely would see different options here, and that's okay. Just copy the information from your data sheet to this form. The form will be different at the Nebraska Bumble Bee Atlas site. So make sure you're using the right site. And then you're going to answer the questions about management. So yes, I saw mowing. There was no cattle grazing. I suspected that there was native grazing, no agriculture, no insecticide use, no herbicide use, no controlled wildfire, and I didn't see any honeybee hives when I was there. If you had any notes here about the chemicals that were used, or about the fire, or about how many honeybees you observed, you could put that here in this notes box. Next, we're going to move on to floral resources, and here you're just going to check how many flowers that you observed on the landscape, or how many different species of flowers. I saw 5 to 10, so I'm going to check that. And then we're going to enter which plants that we actually saw. And it's important to note that you don't have to enter into this form the same species of flowers that you entered when you entered your bumblebee data. So remember, when we entered our bumblebee data, we entered the host plant. So we already have that information. We already know that bumblebees were seen visiting it. So we don't have to re-enter those data here. And this is a bit of a different protocol from last year and the year before. So if you've participated before, hopefully this will make things a little bit easier for you. But also, this should simplify things a little bit. And then you're just going to scroll down and you're going to copy the information from your data sheet, and this is on the back of the data sheet, to the form here. So you're just going to enter the common name and then the plant species name. And please do your best to be consistent with your spelling between surveys. There are so many different spellings, especially of common names, and that's the reason we ask you to enter the species name if you can. So please do your best to find out what the specific name is and enter it in there to the best of your ability. And then you can move on to plant 2, and this one was a false dandelion. And in this case, I don't know what the species name was. I'm just going to put the genus down here. I was a little bit lazy when I did my survey because I was focusing on filming and making this educational, so I didn't do my due diligence. So hopefully you'll be better than me when you conduct your survey. Plant 3 was the dandelion, and I don't need to enter that one because a bumblebee was seen observing, and I already entered that information into the Bumblebee Watch database. And then I'm done entering my plant data. If you had more, you could click on these arrows and it would open up additional options all the way up through plant 15 here. And then it asks if you were a volunteer when you were conducting the survey. If you say no here, you're just going to sign and be done, which would be what I would do, because I wasn't actually volunteering when I did this. I was working or being paid to do this. If you're being paid to do this, you would say no here. I think most of you will probably answer yes to this question, and then it'll just enter the next page where you're going to enter your volunteer data. So you're going to say how many people participated in this survey. My daughter helped me with this survey. And then it says, so I'm going to enter 2 people here. And then it says, considering all volunteers, how many hours did you spend traveling to and from and conducting the survey? So for myself, it was probably around 3 hours, and my daughter also 3 hours. So in this box, I would enter 6 hours. If your travel took place on a different day than your survey, you would enter that before. So in other words, if you traveled to a different part of the state, you would enter that here. Or if you traveled one day and then did the survey the next day and then traveled home the third day, you might enter a third date. Most of you will probably just not fill these out because you will probably have traveled, done your survey, and then traveled home on the same day. These are just an option if it was a multi-day trip. And then how many miles round trip did you drive to conduct your survey? For me, this was relatively close. It was probably about 6 miles. And then I have done all of my survey data, and I'm done. And then it says now, by signing below, you certify that all details in the survey are correct to the best of my ability. And so then I'm just going to go down here, and using my mouse, I'm going to sign the box. And then I'm all done, and I can click submit, and it will give me a confirmation that I've submitted my data correctly. Just to show you what would happen, if I click submit and I haven't filled out all the data, it will take you back and actually let you know that you have not submitted your data correctly and that you have to fix that before you move forward. So there's a lot of required questions that you have to answer before you submit the data. So you can go ahead and then fix it and then click submit, and you'll get a confirmation that you have submitted your data correctly. And there you go. And if you need to enter another habitat survey, you can click here to do that. And then go on. And that's it. Now you've entered your bumblebee data and your habitat data, and you should be all done. So thanks so much for watching and for submitting your data and for conducting surveys for the Bumblebee Atlas project. And again, I hope you're out there staying safe and only conducting surveys if it's appropriate, and it's your state and local officials and healthcare professionals have agreed that it's the right thing to do, and you feel like it's best for your personal health, or you feel like it's okay for your personal health to go out and do this. Again, please don't jeopardize yourself to do bumblebee surveys. We've got time in front of us to do that, and we can come back to this. The most important thing is that you and your community stay healthy and safe. So again, thank you so much for participating today, and thanks so much for collecting and submitting your data for us. Take care.
Okay, do we want to field a few questions, or do we want to jump into Bumblebee?
I think there's some questions that are specifically related to survey that we should probably address now, if that's okay with you.
Yep, that sounds good.
Okay. Some of the ambitious watchers are wondering if they can survey more than 2 times in a season and whether it's possible to adopt more than 1 grid cell.
Yes, you can do as many surveys as you want to. You can adopt as many grid cells as you want to. I know there's a couple people in Nebraska that have 9 grid cells altogether. You don't have to necessarily adopt a grid cell. So if you just adopt your one grid cell, you're welcome to survey wherever you want and submit data as long as you do your initial 2 for the cell that you adopted.
There's a couple people that are asking questions about finding more than one of the same bee, or if there's a bunch of the same, how many do they need to capture? Is one enough? Do they need to do 10, 30? What's the best protocol there?
Yeah, so we want you to catch all the bees that you can find. And that's just because we want to be able to verify all the species that we're seeing. If you are somebody who's very confident in your identification, you can talk to us and we may be able to help you out and make that situation a little bit easier. But for now, we want everybody to catch all the bees that they can see.
Yeah, and just to explain that a little bit further, there's so many lookalike species out there that, and you're going to see that in a little bit when Katie moves forward, and we talk about introducing you to the species in Missouri. That there's just sometimes subtle differences, and until you really get to know the fauna, it's important that we're not missing anything. So, so at the bare minimum, you know, like if you have a field of Joe Pyeweed that has like 1,000 bumblebees in it, you know, at least try to get a minimum of 10 that look the same to you. And if you get 10, you're likely to get a pretty, you know, the lookalikes as well. But as Katie mentioned, the best practice is to just capture all of the bumblebees that you see in your survey. If you have the same bee species on the same plant, do you need to enter all of them?
Yes.
Yes, and again, if you are someone who is confident in your Bumblebee ID and confident in your plant ID, there's actually a different way to enter your data. It's called a checklist, and if you're confident and feel like you can identify your bumblebees well, reach out to Katie or myself, and we can elevate your Bumblebee Watch account, which will allow you to use that checklist option. Especially if you're going to be doing a lot of surveys, we're happy to make that available for those people that can effectively use it. Why doesn't the identification sheet include males?
Good question. So the survey time that we're going to be going out, most of us are going to be finding males, unless it's surveys happening in this time period. Actually, you might find a couple males, but trying to identify males is a little bit trickier because their color patterns are more variable. There's a few species that are lookalike. So we're targeting the season where when you're going out, most of the time you're going to be finding females. So we're providing a guide for females, but there is an online resource, Bee Spotter, that has a guide for some of the males if you do come across that.
They have an online resource, and it's also available as a PDF that you could download. And I'll share the link to that in the next module while Katie is presenting the ID section. Does survey time include the time that it takes to enter my data?
Your volunteer hours? Yes.
Yeah. Yep. I think that's probably it for now. Let's jump into, there's one more question. Do we only record the plants that were in bloom while I was during the survey?
Yes. So if there's plants that are not in bloom yet, or they're past bloom, we don't want to know that those ones are there. So just the ones that are flowering at the time that you're there.
That's great. I think we can move on.
Hey, Rich, there was one question in chat wondering if the partners, we could facilitate people in the same community getting together. And that's really the point of having the Facebook site and the Twitter site and the like, is for all of us volunteers to get on there, share stories, ask for help, and try and get together if that's possible. So try to get onto those. I know I got onto the Facebook site today. It's typed in Missouri Bumble Bee Atlas in the search bar and got to it pretty easily. So
We can probably share a link to it in the chat too. But yeah, that's a good place where other volunteers are going to be. So if you have questions about the project, or you want to share something that you saw, or you have this great spot that you know there's going to be a whole bunch of bees and you want somebody else to come help you, you might be able to ask somebody in that group if they want to go out and survey. So really utilize that Facebook group and just take advantage of each other in the project.
Yeah, just unfortunately, people, not unfortunately, but people just have different values and concerns about privacy. And so we just haven't been playing matchmaker, but definitely people have made matches within grid cells and created pods to do surveys together. And that's a wonderful thing. And I think that's one of the great plate pieces that the Facebook group has facilitated. So yeah, I'm just echoing what's already been said, but yeah, it should be a good resource for you.
The other thing you might consider if you're a member of like Missouri Master Naturalist or Missouri Gardeners is to get into that network and see if you can find somebody to pair up with.
Okay. I'm going to share my screen here again. We're going to dive into bumblebee identification. And for some of you watching those videos, some of the information might have gone right over your head, but I promise once you start working with bumblebees, it'll all become a little bit easier. It's just like the same thing with birds or plants. When you start learning a new group of organisms, you start picking up on those characteristics to pay attention to. So let's see where the mouse is. Oops. Oh, it started at the beginning. Let me get to the middle. PowerPoint wants to take its time tonight. Okay, here we are. So the first thing that you want to be aware of when you go out into the field and you start noticing everything that's buzzing around on top of flowers is, are you actually even looking at a bee? So in this photo here, there's actually only one bee, right? The rest of these are actually flies. So there's a lot of mimicry that goes on in the insect world. So when you're catching something, you want to be sure that you're actually collecting and photographing a bee. And to make sure you have a bee and not a fly, there's a few things that you can look at. And so the first thing is that when you look at the number of wings, bees have 4 wings and flies have 2. And while bumblebees are in flight, their wings attach and it can look like they only have 2 wings, but as you start peeling them apart when they're chilled, it's a lot easier to see that there's 4 wings there. Bumblebees, as we talked about yesterday, also carry really large pollen loads, so they have those corbicula or the pollen baskets on their hind legs, whereas flies are going to have these sort of chicken legs. There's no big area to collect and transport pollen. Bumblebees are also very hairy compared to a lot of our flies, although there are flies that can have a lot of hair on them. Bumblebees also have long antennae compared to flies that have these short stubby ones. And then if you look at the eyes on a bee, they're actually on the side of the head versus on a fly where you can kind of see they have more of that typical bug-eyed insect that you would think of. So they have these really large eyes that almost connect at the top of their head, whereas bumblebees are on the side of their head, a little bit smaller, less bulbous looking. Another species that you might confuse with a bumblebee are carpenter bees. And somebody asked about these yesterday, the functional difference. There's a lot of difference in these two types of bees as far as their life history goes. But when you're just looking at them, they can look very, very similar. They both have the same colors, they're about the same size. And so the way to tell these apart is that carpenter bees have a very shiny, metallic-y abdomen, whereas bumblebees will have a lot of hair on the abdomen. The next thing is carpenter bees will have hairs on their hind legs, so they'll have that dense brush or comb of hairs, the scopa, instead of having a grooved out corbicula. So the difference is the comb of hairs versus the pollen basket. Another thing that you'll see is that males of these species have sort of like a mask on their face, whereas bumblebees, all that coloration that you're going to see on the face is going to be coming from hairs rather than the carpenter bee that's sort of right on their exoskeleton. Carpenter bees also don't have a colony, so they actually nest in hardwoods and will have more of a linear nest that you can see in that photo there. So when you're out in the field and you're looking for bumblebees, the way that you can tell is that they're very large, very hairy, and they have a very robust body size. All of the bees in Missouri, I believe, are black and yellow. I don't think there's any with orange on them. And again, pay attention to that pollen basket. So the females are going to have that groove on their hind leg that allows them to collect and transport pollen. And you need to be aware that there's going to be variation between species, but also variation within species. So there's going to be slightly different color patterns, whether you're looking at a queen or a worker or a male. And those are also going to have different sizes. And so the time that we're going to be out surveying, most of us are going to be collecting female workers, but there's a good chance that you could collect something else. So to start with Bumblebee ID, it's going to be broken down into 3 parts. And so the first part is you want to look at the colors of the hairs on the head, and that includes the hairs on the front of the face and the hairs on the top of the head. And once you have that, you want to look at the thorax, which is the center part of the body, and notice if there's a pattern on there. So is there a circle in the center of the thorax? Is there a stripe between the wings? Is it half yellow, half black? Just look at the color of the hair pattern there. And then you want to look at the abdomen. And the abdomen is split up into 6 different sections that we call tergites. So tergite 1 or T1 is closest to the thorax, and tergite 6 or T6 is basically the butt of the bee where you would see the stinger. And so each one of these tergites or abdominal segments can have a different color on it. So you just want to notice the different patterns on the abdomen. So this is the identification guide here. And from the top left, it starts with bees that have the least amount of yellow on them, and then it travels down to bees that gradually have more yellow on them. So if we start in that top left corner there, it's with Bombus impatiens, or the common eastern bumblebee, which is a very common species that you'll see. This is one that's commercially reared and shipped all over. So when you look at this bee, you want to notice that on the front of the face, there's black hairs. On the top of the head, there's yellow hairs. And then this one almost has a teardrop or an upside down teardrop shape in the center of a yellow thorax. The key characteristic for this one is that there's only 1 stripe of yellow on its abdomen and the rest are black. The next species that you'll see is Bombus bimaculatus, or the 2-spotted bumblebee. And this is one of the earlier emerging species. So if you're out in April, you might see this one emerge first. And the thing to pay attention to on this bee is that it has a very distinct W shape on its abdomen. So you can see the first tergite there is yellow, and then that second tergite has like a W shape of yellow. And that's what tells you it's the 2-spotted bumblebee. And one that's confused quite a lot with the last 2 that we just went over is the brown-belted bumblebee. And this one is very, very common. It emerges quite early and it stays out quite late. And the key for this one is that it has a crescent shape on T2. So that color, the brown belt that you see there on the second tergite, it doesn't usually go all across the abdomen. It's more like a half moon on that second abdominal segment. And sometimes that crescent is going to be obviously brown, sometimes it's going to be yellow. So just pay attention to it. The other thing that I've noticed with this bee is that it is a very short and even, it's got like a nice little buzz cut to it. So when you look at some other bees, there's some that have long, shaggy hairs, but the brown-belted bee always has very short, even hair that always looks very groomed. And then we have Bombus vagans, or the half-black bumblebee. This one has black hairs on the front of the face and yellow on top of the head. And then it has a black circle in the center of a yellow thorax. The first two segments are yellow, and then the rest are black. And like I said, with the last bee that had short, even hair, this is one of those species that has long, shaggy. It looks a little bit more unkempt. And then we have Bombus fraternus, or the Southern Plains bumblebee. And this is a species of conservation concern, so we're going to be excited if any of you come across this one. I think there's already a few observations from Missouri, but this one has black hairs on the front of the face as well as the top of the head, and then there's a black stripe in between the wings. The first two abdominal segments are yellow, and then the last four are black. A characteristic for this bee is that when you look at the hairs on the abdomen, they tend to lay very flat, almost as if they've been greased back. And then we have the American bumblebee, or Bombus pennsylvanicus. This bee has black hairs on the front of its face and the top of its head, and in the middle of its wings there's a black stripe, and sometimes behind the wings it can be yellow. Sometimes there can be a mix of yellow and black, sometimes it can be yellow. But a lot of the species, at least that we see here in Nebraska, that first abdominal segment is usually half black and half yellow. And this species looks very similar to the one that we're going to go over next, which is the black and gold bumblebee. So just remember that Bombus pennsylvanicus has black hairs on the top of its head, and that will be your defining characteristic, versus the black and gold bumblebee that has yellow hairs on top of the head. So these two species can look very, very similar, which is again why we want you guys collecting all the bees that you can find, because looking at the color of the hairs on top of the head of a bee while it's moving in the field is not the easiest thing to do. So if you can take some good pictures that we can zoom in on and see, it's going to allow us to get that verification on the species. So again, just look for the yellow hairs on the top of the head for the black and gold bumblebee, and black hairs on top of the head for Pennsylvanicus. And then there's Bombus perplexus, or the confusing bumblebee. And as the name suggests, this bumblebee can have quite a variable color pattern. Sometimes T4 through T6 can be black, sometimes it can be yellow. We're not sure if this species is going to show up in Missouri, but it has a range that's very nearby. So if you're on the eastern edge of Missouri, you might detect this species. And we have Bombus fervidus, or the yellow bumblebee. This one has black hairs on the front of the face and the top of the head, and it has a narrow black bar in between the wings. The majority of this bee is going to be yellow, except for the last two abdominal segments. And when you find males of the yellow bumblebee and the American bumblebee, those are species that can look very, very similar. So getting some good, clear photos of the sides of the thorax and the hairs on the front of the face is very helpful for us to identify which species you've collected. And then there's a couple of cuckoo bees that you might come across. One of them is Bombus citrinus, or the lemon cuckoo bee. The hairs on the front of the face of this one are black, but there can be yellow. The top of the head has yellow hairs. All of the hairs on the thorax are going to be yellow. And then the pattern that you see on the abdomen can be a little bit variable, but what you will probably notice is that there's going to be sparse hair patterns there. So compared to a normal bumblebee, a lot of our cuckoo bees kind of look like they have mange, or they're balding. There's just not a full body of hair there. So if you pick up a bee that looks kind of scraggly, it doesn't have a pollen basket, there might be a chance that it's a cuckoo bee. And the other cuckoo bee that would be really nice to detect because there's not too many observations of this one, is Bombus variabilis, or the variable cuckoo bumblebee. The front of the face on this bee are going to be black, and the top is going to be black with some yellow hairs. The thorax is going to be predominantly yellow with some black on the sides. And then the abdomen is going to be black if you collect a female. But there, if you see the small diagram, the males can be extremely variable, so hence the name there. And then lastly is Bombus affinis, or the rusty patch bumblebee. And Rich went over this species in the PowerPoint yesterday, but just to remind you, this is a federally protected species. So if you are going to come across this, on the next slide here, I think I have a map of it. If you do collect a species that has that rusty patch on the second abdominal segment, you are probably going to be in these green cells highlighted here. So if you are going to be surveying in those cells, we would like you to look through this guide and learn how to identify the bee, as well as log on to the fishandwildlife.gov profile page so that you can learn what the necessary steps are to handling this if you come across it. It is unlikely that it's going to be detected in this area, but we would just like you to be aware of the possibility if you're in those 5 or 6 grid cells. And then the last thing is just, again, be aware of variation. So variation can come between queens, workers, and males. There can be variation in size, even within the same colony. So here we're looking at Bombus griseocollis just as an example, and you can see that that crescent on the second abdominal segment can be brown, it can be yellow, it can be all the way across, it can be a tiny crescent, it can be a big crescent. So these species do have the ability to vary within species, and it's just something that you should be aware of. And lastly, for ID resources. So again, this will become easier as you go out in the field and you start familiarizing yourself and you're getting up close and personal. It's a lot of information to throw at you right now, but I promise it will get easier. There's a PDF called Bumblebees of the Eastern United States. It is very helpful. It has range maps and color patterns, as is the book in the middle there, Bumblebees of North America. I find that to be very useful. It has a lot of extra information about life histories in there, an identification guide. Again, there's that pocket guide for the rusty patch bumblebee. And then using the actual Bumblebee Watch app, that same feature that we watched in the video earlier of going through and identifying what you have based on characteristics, you can do that right from your phone. And then Bee Spotter also has the PDF and an online source that will tell you about some of the bumblebee species in Missouri. And I think with that, we can take any more questions. On the screen here. Yeah, but thanks everybody for attending. We'll see what kind of questions we've got here.
Thank you, Katie. That was great. I've put a bunch of links to those identification resources in the chat box there. So hopefully you've been following along there. And like I said, I will send in, I'm not sure how I will share the chat with you from this, but I will find a way. I may just send it out to those of you that attended so I don't have to post it to the website. But we'll find a way to get it to you for sure. Not too many questions have popped up here. There is one question that says, for the 2020 survey, since it's already mid-August, are we expected to complete 2 surveys before the end of September?
We cannot expect that of you, no. So do what you can at the end of the season. If it's not feasible, that's totally okay. But we're hoping that a couple people get out and survey for us. Looks like the rest are answered.
Rich, there was one question early on I don't think got answered, and the question,
okay.
How can we get can we use MDC areas? And the answer is yes. You will likely need a special use permit, which is free, but to get that, you need to contact the area manager. If you don't know who the area manager is, you can contact one of the nearest conservation department offices and find out, get their contact info. And if you need help, if you need help, get on the Facebook page and ask the question.
Thank you. I misinterpreted that question, and I'm really glad that you addressed that. I sort of was thinking it was more of a, how do we do a survey, but I understand the question now. So thank you for addressing that. I really appreciate that. There's another question about how long we have to work with a bee before it thaws out, Katie. So maybe you could just address that one more time.
So it's going to depend on the bee. Sometimes you have some stubborn ones that, stubborn bees that don't want to fall asleep. But usually you'll have about a solid minute before they start to wake up, which after you've photographed a few bees is plenty of time. If the bee does start to wiggle around while you're still trying to take photographs, you can just put it right back in the vial and put it back on ice.
Yeah, but that's one of the reasons that in the video there, you remember that I took some photographs of an inanimate object first, just to make sure that the settings on my camera were right, so that I wasn't fiddling with my camera while the first bee was waking up and potentially flying away before I get a chance to take a picture of it. So you do want to make sure the settings in your camera are right before you get started, because that, especially if it's a warm, humid day, they can warm up pretty quickly. All right. Well, there are no further questions.
There's a few questions on here.
Okay.
Do we need to monitor the exact same site in the grid we select, or just somewhere in the grid? You can monitor different sites. You can go back to the same site. If you want to do 2 surveys in the same day, we ask that you do them at 2 different locations. Do you need permission to survey on a national wildlife refuge? That would be yes. You can reach out to them for a permit, or you can just do like taking photos, and as long as you're not collecting and taking anything, you are allowed to take photographs.
But if you're going to do a survey on a Fish and Wildlife Service, National Wildlife Refuge, you will need a special use permit, just like Bill explained for the MDC sites.
Yeah.
You should reach out to the site manager, and you just have to fill out a pretty simple application. We can help with that if you need it, or communicate with the site manager if they need to better understand the survey or what we're doing, and we're happy to assist with that if needed. But you would need a permit to do official survey if you're capturing and chilling bumblebees. But if you're just taking pictures of bees on flowers, you can definitely do that.
Yep. And do we need any identification to show we are volunteering for the Bumblebee Atlas? No. Hopefully some cool shirts will come from this, but we're not positive on that.
Okay, it seems like we have reached the end of our time together. Again, want to thank everyone for being here. I believe when you close this, that it should bring up an evaluation form. And if you spend a couple of minutes filling out that evaluation form, that will really help us. I'm also just pasting a link to the evaluation form right now. But feedback from other volunteers has helped make this program as good as it is today, but I'm sure there are improvements that we can be making. So if you have suggestions for improvements or ways that we could make these more accessible for you, please do provide that feedback. It's really helpful for us. But in the meantime, please get out, and I hope there's some good weather ahead for you to get out and do some surveys. And please use the resources available, including all of us that are panelists here. We're happy to communicate with you. Our phone numbers and our email addresses are available in the participant handbook and on the website. So please use the resources that are out there. The website is a treasure trove as well. And hopefully you have what you need to get started. And thanks so much for all that you're doing for bumblebees in Missouri. We look forward to seeing what comes of it. Thanks a lot. Okay. It's funny. I obviously went through that last night, and then a bunch of people emailed me saying they couldn't get in. So apparently, when you manually remove someone, like it prevents and blocks their URL from working again in the future. So that's a learning experience for me that I need to remember. So there were a few people that couldn't get in tonight, but I did help them get back in. So hopefully it didn't deter too many people. But it looked like we were at about 97 for most of the evening. So that's pretty darn good.
You want to stop the recording?
Are you going to say some nasty things about me?
Maybe.